Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LPL Week 1 weekly overview, analysis, and power rankings video. Super excited to finally get back into the swing of things when it comes to the weekly recaps here on this channel. Of course, we've been doing all of these big primer videos on Super K-Man Rocks over the past couple of weeks, whether it be for the LPL or the LCK or the LEC, and of course next week for the LTA North. You can check out all of those videos up in the iCard. The first one listed will obviously be the LPL video if you are interested in my thoughts on these teams coming into the year, but it's time to actually jump into the games of the year. This is really the start of what the rest of the year is likely going to look like on this channel. As longtime viewers are probably aware of, we're going to be going through every single best of 5 that happened here in week number 1. Small caveat, I do apologize getting this video out one day late. One of the series has already happened in week number 2. That will not be happening in upcoming weeks. We just had a bit of a scheduling conflict in terms of getting this out on Saturday, so this is coming out on Sunday. Again, that's probably not going to happen at any other point. I will not be talking about the series that happened this previous night, so there will be one that's saved for next week, but we will be talking about every technical week 1 series here in the LPL. If you are unfamiliar with the new format, I talk about it a bit in the LPL primer video, and obviously I would very much recommend you go check that out, but every team is split into a group A, B, C, or D. There are 4 teams in each group with 16 teams, obviously, and the top 2 teams from each group after a single round robin end up making it to the quote-unquote playoffs, and this is a best of 5 single round robin. This is hard fearless. This is, it's technically what they're calling it. We know it in North America as full fearless from the NACL, which means that once a champion is picked on either side, it is unable to be used by either side for the rest of the series. If one team picks Viego in game number 1, neither team can use Viego from that point onwards, and game number 1 side selection is chosen by a 1v1. You know, kind of an interesting format. At the end of the day, I don't really think it changes too much. It means that this is going to be a lot more similar to the summer split in terms of how we talked about a lot of these games rather than the spring or before. There's not this giant regular season round robin type of format like there used to be, but there still is a lot of interesting stuff to talk about, and with best of 5s, there certainly is a lot to dissect. So without further ado, let's get right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover in today's video, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will, of course, be updating my power rankings at the end, but all of that is contextual. Some teams might move up more than you're expecting, some teams might not move up more than you're expecting, even with some of the results that they've been having. There certainly were some upsets in the LPL, at least in terms of my power rankings, and we'll go over that when we get there. There are definitely some interesting groups to talk about as we go further along, but our first series that kicked off the LPL here in 2025 was, unfortunately, a bit of a blowout, and kind of an expected blowout, and, you know, at least in terms of what the anticipation was for it. It was Weibo Gaming taking on OMG here in Group B, and predictably, Weibo Gaming was able to pick up the 3-0 series win here, the sweep on OMG. Not a surprise. Like we said, this isn't exactly an upset. This isn't exactly something we weren't expecting to see coming. Weibo Gaming is one of the better teams in the league, one of the top 6, in my opinion, that's going to be competing to be like a top 2, top 3 team. They have that kind of talent. I think you could argue they got better in the offseason, or at least more consistent across the board from what they were last year with the addition of players like Tion and Hong, and all of that kind of came to fruition here in this first series. OMG just felt very outclassed, and it really felt like a lot of their quote-unquote pocket picks ended up getting really abused, and some of the playstyle problems that I think this team, you know, theoretically could have with players that aren't exactly super experienced at this level, they very much bled through in this first series. I could see this team even getting worse throughout the rest of this split, but we'll talk about OMG when we get to them. We always start with the winning side in this. Player of the series for me, as you can see denoted in green, is going to be Breathe in the top lane. It's really nice to see Breathe start off the year in such a positive way. He wasn't exactly perfect, I would say, throughout 2024, especially once he got to Weibo Gaming. There were some positives. Obviously, I'm not trying to sit here and say he was like a bottom half top laner or anything like that. He made Worlds for a reason, and he was pretty successful at the World Championships, but he just wasn't consistent for Weibo. There were just so many moments where it felt like he was losing in the mid game for absolutely no reason. Luckily, it does feel like he is at least starting off this year with a lot of confidence. He was really able to run a lot of the games in this series. I think there could be an argument that this should go to Light in the bot lane, which we will get to in a second. But I thought Breathe was very, very impressive, and I thought he was the most impactful player across this series. I think it becomes a lot more difficult to win if you're not getting as much out of Breathe on the top side, whether it was through the Cassante or especially through the Jax in game number 3, where I thought he was excellent. And, we'll talk about it. Harry was not bad at all. Harry actually had a pretty good series. I'm not the biggest fan of Harry, but I thought he was generally fine here. Breathe was definitely the player to watch out for on Weibo, beating a player who definitely looked like he was stepping up, and, just generally, I think, kind of showing that he can be a top 1 or a top 2 top laner if he is in form. That was starting to become a bit of a question for me, all things considered, and I do think this kind of helped calm the nerves a bit. And if he's going to have a really good split, kind of similar to what someone like 369 had in spring of last year for top esports, Weibo is going to be a team that very much competes for top, 2, top 3. Tion's top laners typically play really well, and so that's an encouraging sign for that. But like I said, Light and Hong looking really good in their first little test of action outside of Demacia Cup. Light was excellent in this series, as he basically always is. Starry was again fine, but Moham definitely had some issues in terms of being consistent as an engaged threat on the other side of this matchup. Light did a great job of taking advantage of that in the 2v2, just is so hyper consistent, is never out of position, is always helping out the team in some way, shape, or form, whether that's through direct damage with champions like Jinx and Misfortune or Ashe, just setting everything up for like someone like an Aurora to be able to take over in some of these fights. Light's just always doing what he is supposed to be doing. He doesn't have the craziest mechanical ceiling, but he is just so smart about the game, and he knows exactly where he needs to be, and his mechanics are still fantastic. It's just AD carry, right? It's a very difficult position to be like top 5 in the world mechanically in because of how many good ones there are. Light is maybe a little bit below like the mechanical ceiling of a lot of the other top ADCs like Jackie Love and Elk in the region, but he is like right up there in terms of performance, purely based off of his ability to understand every matchup and know exactly where he needs to be to help out the rest of his team. So Light and Breathe, definitely the standouts here for me. Hong, I think, also had a very good series. Xiaohu was awesome in game number 1 on the Aurora, but was also way too aggro in game number 3 on the Sylas. And Tian was generally fine here. This was actually much more of a facilitative series from Tian, not something we see out of him all that much, especially early on in splits. It's going to be interesting to see if that ends up continuing on for Weibo. If they want to play for their laners a lot more, that's definitely going to be different than what I expected from them playstyle-wise coming into the year. I don't think it's bad. If Tion's going to be so good at playing, Sejuani and things like that, then that's great, and taking more of a backseat role. I think that's going to be huge for Weibo overall, because he's not going to be making gigantic mistakes, and you have enough talent to just be able to outmuscle a lot of the rest of the teams, in the LPL, like full stop, let alone your group here. But it definitely is one of those things where I think to get the most out of this team, you're going to want to unlock Tion at some point. But Breathe and Light were so good in this series that it almost didn't matter. And then for OMG on the other side, I think there were good moments of this series. I think there were bad moments. Obviously, 0-3 is not ideal, but Weibo's a good team. You didn't come in here expecting to win, or at least I wouldn't have come in here expecting to win. I think 3 players ended up playing generally okay here. Harry was definitely the standout in a positive way for me. I think Lin Fang also had a pretty good series. I think the Mbessa actually looks like something that is playable. We'll see if that ends up continuing to be something in the mid lane that gets a lot of play. I really liked it into Victor. I thought it was something that actually had a lot of pressure in Prio. The solo laners in general were definitely the standouts in a positive direction, which is good because they were part of the big question mark for me. I thought the bot lane was probably going to be the big positive of this team with how highly I thought of Starry, and Starry certainly wasn't awful in this series. He was generally fine, just didn't really have a ton of opportunities to do things. But if Harry and Lin Fang can both be league average in terms of their solo lanes, which they definitely looked like they could be in a series like this, I think that's going to be good enough for OMG to be around this number 11 ranking. Not going to be good enough to beat teams that are near the top 5 like Weibo, but a team that's going to be good enough to be where their expectations lie. It was honestly a lot of the new additions that ended up just being awful here in game number 1. Series number 1, you can see that Moham is getting dud of the series. This one was pretty obvious to me. Just inting in the last game on Leona. I mean, really, there's no other way to say it. We just had a horrible game in game number 3. I think if you wanted to give this to Hang, that is also super, super doable. I thought the Zyra was too impactful to give him dud of the series, but, for the Nocturne and the Maokai games, absolutely, he was miserable throughout the beginning part of the series. Both jungle and support were massive hindrances, and that's a question mark. Hang had a miserable end to his 2024, ended up getting replaced on WE, and there was a lot of negative feelings about Hang going into the year. That has not started off in a good way, I would say, in 2025. He's going to need to turn that around, or he's going to very quickly become the biggest hindrance to any team in the league, because that's kind of what he was for WE at times last year. And then Moham, I've never been the biggest Moham fan in the world. I think he's one-dimensional in the sense that he's a really good engaged player, and I think is going to be fine for setting up Starry against other teams, but against good teams, supports just get taken advantage of, and that's just kind of what we saw here. I'm not going to overreact. Reddit is always going to say the things that they're going to say. People talking about Moham, saying, oh, Moham only looked good because he was next to an even worse support in Kellen. I like both of them. I think they're generally both like mid-table in terms of LPL. I think both of them could be mid-table supports in terms of LCK. And I think that is going to reflect itself across a wider span, but against Weibo, against Light and Hong, Moham just wasn't really able to go toe-to-toe as we saw at the World Championships. So for OMG, kind of what I expected. For Weibo Gaming, kind of what I expected. Maybe in an opposite way, where it's like Tian not necessarily being the main character like I anticipated, but Breathe and Light looking so good is really encouraging, especially Breathe. If he can stay on, that's going to be very difficult for other teams to deal with. But then moving on now to our second series of week number 1 here, and it's a Demacia Cup rematch here to kick off Group C. We'll see if the upset can carry through. It's ThunderTalk Gaming taking on LNG Esports. And yeah, the upset absolutely carries through. ThunderTalk is going to pick up the 3-1 series win here, and for the second time in like a month, they have beaten LNG in a major series, and that's not a good look for LNG. They have not played anybody else in the last, configuration of this team other than ThunderTalk, and they've lost both times. Obviously, I'm not going to try to enter panic mode just yet. I still think this team could theoretically be fine if things get on board, but man, there's a lot going wrong with this team at the current moment. This is honestly a very similar series to what we just saw with the Weibo Gaming OMG series, where solo laners are generally fine, and honestly, solo laners were kind of in favor of LNG, but everything else was just such a disaster that it actually didn't end up mattering. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series is going to go to Feather in the support position. If you wanted to give this to 1xN, obviously the scoreline is ridiculous, and I think he played well here. He did a really good job of following up on what a lot of other, people on this team ended up creating, but at the end of the day, Feather was the creator of this team. I think he was the one really pushing forward a lot of what they were doing in this series, and honestly, I was crazy impressed by Feather. I know the Blitzcrank has always been such a popular pick for him. It's been something that you kind of have to keep in mind, and, the Lulu and the Twitch very much did not work out on the other side of this matchup, but for Feather in particular to be able to get, one of those moments where you can just be the main character of the team, it's really, really good to see, because one of the reasons I was a little bit less bullish, I would say, on ThunderTalk's bot lane in general when everybody was so in on 1xN is because I just didn't know what Feather was going to give you as a support. I didn't know if he was going to be an above average support at this level. This was very much an above average type of series. He absolutely mega gapped Photic and Juo, who, to their credit, have at times looked okay, but anybody who follows the channel knows that I'm a huge Photic hater. We'll continue that here. Do not worry. He continues to play awful, and I think now that he's not protected by the rest of his team being fine, I think it's going to get even worse, very similar to 2023. We'll get to that when we get to it, but Feather did a great job of capitalizing on the mistakes of LNG and just quite frankly, being the best player in the bot lane, and 1xN really was not that far behind. I do want to give him a big shout out because maybe I just have been underrating him. Everybody yells at me all year long that like, oh, you don't give 1xN enough credit. You're not giving him enough praise for how good his mechanics are, for how much potential he has as a player. I think his mechanics are good. I think they're above average. I just don't think they're like superstar worthy, and that's kind of where I draw the line. You see a lot of people talking about him as if he's a top 5 or top 6 ADC. He's just not proven that at the LPL level. If he has more games like this, and if Feather continues to break out, this is going to be a very similar bot lane to, what On and Wink were for a lot of the spring split last year, where I was hyping them up. If 1xN can be on for this team, that's more than enough for them to be good, like especially for them to be able to make top 2 in a group that's as wide open as Group C is. Probably the easiest group, I would say, to make top 2 of any group in the entire league. I mean, Group D is definitely giving them a run for their money, but this bot lane was excellent, and you really can't say anything negative about it. Hoya was also fine, generally speaking, on the top side. He was losing lane pretty hard, but he was useful in team fights. I think people are going to overlook that. We'll talk about Zika, who was excellent on the other side of this matchup, and definitely the best player on LNG, but Hoya was generally fine. Beishwan and Satab, not exactly perfect here. I think Beishwan definitely out-jungled Weiwei in the wins, but didn't really have to do a whole ton in order to get there. Again, he kind of coasts off his ability to be in the right place at the right time, rather than his ability to fight. And Satab looked really good up until that 4th game on Azir, where he looked horrible. His Azir mechanics were miserably bad. I'm still a little bit out on Satab. He just has not really proven that he can play at a top level just yet. The Akali game was really solid, and the Victor game was also pretty good. So I'm not going to sit here and say that there's nothing to like about his tape so far, especially because he was good at Demacia Cup, but it's kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out for me when it comes to Satab. He also was losing lane to Haichao on the other side. Not that that is surprising, but the bot lane kind of carrying ThunderTalk, and that's what everybody, wanted to see out of this team. That's what they gave you in this first series, so good for them. And then for LNG, Poor Zika. Like, there's really not much else to say. I would say, like, half poor Haichao. Like, he was pretty good in most of these games as well. Definitely was surviving and winning lane against Satab and looking good early, even if he was, like, not impactful at all in the back half of these games. But Zika was awesome. Like, this was genuinely a top 3, top 4 top laner in the league type of performance from Zika, and it just didn't matter. Like, it actually was completely worthless because the rest of his team was miserable. Weiwei got outplayed pretty hard by Beishuan, which is never a good look because, you know, Beishuan's not exactly known for being able to gap opposing junglers, and the narrative surrounding Beishuan has always been he's good at beating junglers that are kind of lower in the rankings and not so good at beating junglers that can outskill him. I've never been a big fan of Weiwei. That is very, very vocal, I would say, on this channel, and this very much kind of confirms that opinion. And if you want a player that I've been low on that continues to just not look good, it's Photic. I mean, he's dud of the series. He was pretty horrible down the stretch here. He just continues to not capitalize at all on the things that LNG is doing well, and if he was even like a league average bot laner, they would have won at least a couple of games in this series, at least a second game in this series, but he can't be a league average bot laner. Like, he just doesn't really have that in him. I hate to say that this has been a good take, but go back to 2022 on this channel, and I was, you know, criticizing Photic and saying that everybody calling him one of the top 580 carries in the world was, you know, crazy, and there was just no evidence on tape to back that up. Every single year I have continued to kind of say, we gotta pump the brakes on Photic with the exception of 2024 spring, where he was good, but 2024 summer was bad. 2023, he was like the worst player in the LPL. Like, this guy is just not good enough to be a player that is on a team where they need him to win. Like, he has to be protected in basically every instance, and he's just not protected here on LNG, and that came out here. Not that Juo was a ton better. I think he had some moments where he was fine. Generally speaking, I think the Lulu was pretty bad in game number 4. Twitch Lulu does not feel particularly strong. You know, full Fearless definitely makes it a lot more interesting in terms of the champions that needed to be picked, but bot lane looks like it's going to be a problem for LNG, and if that's the case, it doesn't matter how well Zika plays on the top side. There's going to be no way to salvage a lot of these games. Haichao, I think, is good, and I think in a different circumstance, he would have, you know, maybe had more of an impact, but he kind of fell off in the later half of these games. You know, LNG has issues to fix. This team has not looked good at all in their current configuration, and they don't really seem to have a playstyle. If bot lane and jungle are just going to be bad, this could be the worst team in the group. That's really not out of the realm of possibility. And Thunder Talk, you know, for the second time in like a couple of weeks, has now beaten LNG in a major best of series. I'm not going to sit here and guarantee you that they are going to get out of this group in top 2, but it is wide open. Like, that second spot is very much up for grabs. EDG, I think, is a good team, and that's going to be a very important series for Thunder Talk later on in the regular season, but at least for now, they're showing everything that they need to show, and there is a real chance that that Demacia Cup breakout was at least a little bit real. Then moving on now to series number 3, and we're moving to Group D, and this is another group that I think is like kind of open, not nearly as open as Group C, but still one that you definitely got to fight for, and the bottom teams all have something to play for in my opinion, and this one was big. It's RNG taking on FunPlus Phoenix. It's probably the 2 bottom teams in the group that, if you want to make that top 2, if you want to try to make that upset, you need to win a series like this, and RNG did exactly that, coming out at the start of this split and really starting off hot. This was kind of a shocking outcome for me, not because I think FPX is particularly good, but because RNG was just so bad at Demacia Cup that I thought it was just going to be a bit of a slow start for them. You know, both of these teams kind of not showing up at that tournament, but RNG really, really struggling, and luckily, a lot of the faith that I had in them in my power rankings at the beginning of this split ended up coming into fruition. They came in 12th, which I think was a lot higher than where a lot of people had them. FPX, obviously, at 10 is a lot higher than where a lot of people had them, but it's nice to see that RNG can kind of carry some of the theoretical momentum that they've been generating over the past year into this, and then FPX, they just kind of look like a team that's not ready to compete at this level. They look like a lot of young players that don't really have a great grasp of how to close out games or how to be consistent really in any way. Game number 1 was really solid, and we'll talk about that, but there are definitely issues with this team as a whole. Player of the series, it's gonna go to Tong Yuan. Is Scrim's Tong Yuan finally here? Is the golden glue of the LPL actually like finally alive and well and ready to go? Where, you know, we've heard so much all the time about how this guy obliterates scrims every single split, about how he dominates off of, you know, stream and just kind of is able to really take advantage of every mid laner, and it's never been there at the LPL level. He had like a 2-week stretch in his rookie split where it was like okay. Outside of that, it's just not been good for him as a player. He was miserably bad last year, but this was really good. I see a lot of people talking about how Milky Way is kind of like salvaging Tong Yuan. I don't necessarily know where that narrative is coming from. Milky Way played really well in this series. I'm certainly not trying to say that like Milky Way didn't help Tong Yuan play better in this series, because that is the truth, but It's not like Milky Way is known as some mid lane savior. Care was awful last year. He actually had like a huge down year because all of his resources were going to Milky Way. I would say it's the opposite. Typically speaking, I would expect mid laners to get worse playing with Milky Way, or at the very least to get less like dominant in terms of carry performances when they play with Milky Way, but that was not the case for Tong Yuan. Really nice to see that he has like enough mechanical talent to actually be able to go toe-to-toe, but it is worth noting FPX is not exactly the most dominant team in the world, and Care is certainly not the kind of player that has been on the hottest of streaks, even if he was okay in this series, all things considered. Tong Yuan definitely needs to show that he can do this against the top two teams projected in this group, but at least for now, like getting across the first hurdle, that's what you have to do, and so, congratulations to him. He did look great in this series, and Milky Way also looked really good in this series. They need to be kind of the stars of this team, as I talked about. I thought topside was really going to have to be the carries. Xiaoshu was somebody that I kind of expected to have a pretty big split. He wasn't great in this series. He definitely had a couple of bad moments, I would say, in lane. Sheer was fine. Sheer's a good player. Definitely a good laner. Still needs to clean up a lot of the stuff after laning phase, but Xiaoshu wasn't the star here. Milky Way still was able to really impact the game heavily. The really important thing for me when I was watching this is that he was able to do it on champions that don't require a ton of early game, like, assistance. Like, Lee Sin and Xin Zhao obviously are very skirmish heavy. I think they fit his style really well, and they're things that I would expect him to play, but the Karthus is not something I would have expected to look good for Milky Way, and it absolutely did. Like, it's kind of the opposite style of what I would have anticipated Milky Way being good at, like a heavy power farmer that wants to play for team fights in the late game. That's just not who I see in Milky Way as a player, and so to see him come out and actually succeed on a champion like that is very encouraging. But jungle mid, definitely the standout. Bot lane was pretty good too. Jiechi, I thought, was actually really good in game number 2 on the Varus. That was the one that he really took over here, but him and Lele, hopefully they can just be a league average bot lane. If they're a league average bot lane, like, jungle is good enough to be like a primary win condition for this team. Xiaoshu, I presume, will start to play better as the split goes along. His track record is just better than what he showed in this series. He wasn't bad in this series, just that I think he will probably step up his game even a bit more. And if Tong Yuan's success is sustainable, really in any way, yeah, this team could be top, 8 or 9. Like, that's super realistic for a team like RNG. And then for FPX on the other side, they're just too inexperienced and just a little bit out of their depth when it comes to being able to play out these long best of 5s. I think game number 1 did show, kind of why I wanted to put them at number 10, because I do think when things are going right, I could see them really going right. Like Bat and Jue, I think, did a really good job. Even Care did a really good job in game number 1 of being able to, like, push these advantages and really control the game when they are playing from a lead. But when they're not doing that, when these games are going 35 minutes in game 2 and 45 minutes in game 4, like, they are just not as comfortable in those situations, I think, as teams like RNG that have more experienced players on the other side. Dud of the series was kind of difficult. I don't think anybody ran it down quite as much as the first 2 series that we talked about, but Sorrow is going to get it for me in the jungle. I'm just not impressed with him so far. I think mechanically speaking, he's super average. I think decision-making wise, he's super average. I just don't really see like a standout trait from him individually. And, I talked about this in the primer, but they do have Shadow on this roster, and I do think it makes a lot of sense to bring someone like Shadow in who can control the mid-game a lot cleaner and be able to get you to Otacon and be able to get you into the spot where you can fight for a lot of these big objectives a lot easier. Sorrow just doesn't really seem like he's going to be able to hold up against a lot of the other junglers at this level. We'll see if that ends up continuing, but like I said, some good and some bad. Jue was excellent in game number 1 on the Nico, and then awful throughout the rest of the series. If you wanted to give dead of the series to Jue, I think that's pretty understandable and pretty fair. I just wanted to give some credit to the Nico game because it was really good to watch him, create with a lot of those ultimates. Bat, I think, also just looked outclassed. Jiechi was definitely the better of the 2 rookie AD carries. Care, his scoreline looks good, but Tong Yuan was absolutely the better mid laner and certainly was more consistent. Sheer was the one player on the team. Once again, the losing top laner actually looking pretty fine. It's kind of a running trend right now, I guess, in the LPL. Sheer was fine. He still shows a lot of mechanical talent, and his laning phases are still really solid, but again, he just doesn't really have a great idea of what to do after that. He's going to be a non-issue for this team. I think his mechanical ceiling is just, or his mechanical floor is good enough to be able to let him survive in a lot of these matchups, but if Sorrow is not good enough to jungle at this level, which he still has to prove that he is, or if Jue is just going to be so flippy like he was for a lot of last year, if Care is not stepping up and winning mid lane matchups against, mid laners that he's supposed to beat, like Tong Yuan, FPX is going to be the worst team in this group, and they're on pace to do that right now. But nice win for RNG. Hopefully they can keep this momentum going. Might be the only one they get in the group stage, depending on how things go, but getting 1 win and getting 3rd in this group, I think, is going to be encouraging moving into spring. Then moving on now to our fourth series of the week as we kind of go over the halfway point here, and it's actually a team that's playing twice in week number 1, which is certainly interesting for scheduling. It's Weibo Gaming taking on Ultra Prime, and Weibo is yet again going to pick up their second win of the group. I believe this guarantees them the next stage. It might not. I don't know how things end up going in terms of like tiebreakers if, like, say, Bilibili Gaming were to be utterly awful, which is probably not going to happen, but starting 2-0 in a group where you are only playing 3 series is pretty good. Like, 2-1 is guaranteed at the very least for Weibo, so that's solid. They won't have to play for basically another, like, 3 weeks or something like that. It's just weird how scheduling ended up working out, but Weibo got the job done here at the beginning of the split, and Ultra Prime honestly looked exactly like I thought they would. I think I actually kind of nailed it in my primer. I was really excited for the PCS imports, specifically Jiang on the top side, and yeah, he is like the spark plug of this team. They are doing a lot of really aggressive things. They just don't necessarily have the experience or like the raw talent to go up against some of the best teams in the world. That's fine. Like, I think there's a lot to like about this series from Ultra Prime, so we'll get into it. Player of the series for me, kind of up in the air, back and forth here between Tian and Xiaohu. I'm going to give it to Xiaohu in the mid lane. I thought he was more consistent between the two. I definitely think he was the one to kind of carry the back half of this series, or the back game of this series on the Syndra. Just looked really, really good across all 4 games, even the victor in game 2, where things were kind of going wrong, I would say, for Weibo Gaming. Xiaohu's just looking impressive. He started off this split really well. We were really getting concerned that that downward trajectory that he was on was going to be unsalvageable. Really nice to see him come out here in the first couple of series and genuinely just win. Obviously, I think this one was a little bit more impressive than their first series in this group stage, but, you know, I think both of them were really solid. I think Xiaohu looks like he is, at the very least, more comfortable with Tian than he was with someone like Tarzan last year, and that's just gonna mean good things overall for Weibo. But Tian was also really good in the jungle. We'll talk about this jungle matchup in a moment. It definitely just felt like Tian taking advantage of a player who's really not experienced enough at this level, but I think the most encouraging thing playstyle-wise about Tian throughout these first 2 series is that he is not, like, running it. He's not really playing that mega greedy style that we've kind of known from Tian in the past that he obviously got away with a lot last year, and, you know, really has played since he came over from FPX to Top Esports. Like, really, that version of Tian has always been, like, just so carry-oriented, so greedy in terms of the way that he wants to play the game. That's not really what we saw in the first 2 series here, and I think that is at the very least encouraging. I think he is still making a lot of really good plays, and it's not like he's taken his foot off the gas in the early game or anything like that. I just don't feel like he feels the pressure to get everything on the map and to lose, you know, something for it. Like, he is very much more willing to play within structure, I think, here on Weibo Gaming. I'm not sure if that's just an organizational difference. We'll have to see when Top Esports ends up playing. But at the end of the day, Tian, I think maybe even looks better this year or more complete. We'll see if it ends up with as many highlight moments. He won MVP last year mostly because he was just such a highlight in the summer split. He was so fun to watch, and he was so dominant against teams that were not as good as him. I don't think you're going to have those same kind of high highs with the playstyle that he adopted here, but the lows, I think, are going to be much higher. At least so far, they've looked really good. Light, Hong, Breathe, they were fine. Light was really good. Hong had a couple of moments where he continued to be a little bit flippier than maybe you would like. You know, you brought him in because you wanted him to be a bit more consistent than someone like Crisp has been for this team. They have similar upsides, but Hong should have a higher floor. That is still to be determined. We're still seeing some flippy moments from Hong. Not that he's immune to those, but certainly something to keep in mind. And Breathe also was like the worst of the 2 top laners after really looking good in their first series. You know, Jiang was awesome in this series, and I think there is a lot to like about him, especially in terms of his laning phase. There's some mental things to clean up, which we'll talk about, but Breathe was not exactly the star of the team in the same kind of way that he was in the first series. You know, I was hyping him up, saying that if he could continue that good form, then I would be really excited. For now, it's, again, back on the wait-and-see approach, but overall, Weibo looking great, starting 2-0, starting, 6-1 in terms of their game score. They're basically guaranteed to get out of this group in the top 2 now. You know, congratulations to them. We're on day number 4, and it already feels like the regular season is over. And then for Ultra Prime on the other side, I actually was kind of impressed with this team in this series. I know that feels like a weird thing to say considering they lost 3-1, but first of all, they're playing one of the scarier teams in the LPL in Weibo Gaming. They really had no expectations going into this, and I do think they actually showed a lot of fire and a lot of fight. They were not scared. That is definitely not something you can say about Ultra Prime. They brought that, like, PCS mentality over here to the LPL, which I think was really exciting. Jiang was the player that I really highlighted in my primer, and that looked really good in this series because he looked really good. This guy's mechanics are insane. His laning laning ability is genuinely absurd. When people were talking about players like Xiaoshu and Harry as like these breakout top laners in the LPL because of their good laning, you know, they were good laners, and I would say they were above average laners, but they weren't like crazy dominant. I never saw a top 5 upside in either of them. I mean, Xiaoshu, maybe, like you could make the argument that he could be like a top 5 top laner if everything were to go right, but he's never been able to piece it together. Jiang can absolutely be a top 5 kind of talent. Like, this is not the same as You Should Know Me coming over from the PCS where he's like very one-dimensional. He can do a lot of different things. He just is way too overeager in a lot of situations in the game where he'll get something really big, he'll play a situation really well and get this big advantage that he can then push, but he'll overextend in order to try, and instead of getting a small advantage, try to get a big advantage, and in that like greediness, he'll end up getting caught. If you can like teach those out of him, he's got the mechanics to like genuinely be amazing in this league, and we just saw it. Like, we just saw him just dominate Breathe in laning phase for 4 straight games. I'm not going to say all 4, but he was excellent across this series, and if that's going to continue, that's gigantic for Ultra Prime, and that was a big reason why they came in so high. I know a lot of people had them like last or near last in their power rankings. I just don't really see that if Jiang is going to be as good as I think he will be. Wacko was also fine as an import, but everybody else was, you know, good and bad moments. I think Saber and Rosie Love had some really good games. That game 2 from Rosie Love was excellent on the Nico. Nico continues to look like a very strong pick in the support position across the LPL this week, and Saber I thought was fine up until the end of the series where he started to really devolve, but dud of the series for me is going to go to Junhao. He was the one player I was most concerned about when it came to Ultra Prime. He did rank as my worst jungler in the LPL, and that kind of came to fruition here. He just got outplayed, kind of similar to what I talked about with Sorrow, where it's a tough position to be able to adapt to at the LPL level quickly, and Tion is certainly not the jungler to take it easy on another player. Junhao just didn't have the skill or the mental to be able to stand up to someone like Tion. Picking things like Xin Zhao and Kindred is very bold in a matchup like this, and it did not really work out. He's going to have to be better if this team is going to be, you know, number 12 or number 13, but I think everybody else on this team actually did show a lot of encouraging things. Yes, Rosie Love was flipping the game when he really didn't have to in a lot of instances. Saber, I think, definitely isn't as mechanically talented as like the best mid laners in the region, and Zhao Hu was definitely better, but Jiang was great, and I think Rosie Love, Wacko, Saber, they showed good things in that game to win. We just want to see a little bit more consistency coming out of Ultra Prime. But again, nice win for Weibo. Really important one. Gets them to 2-0, and they can really take the rest of the regular season pretty easy now. But then moving on now to series number 5, and this one was a pretty obvious outcome, and yet somehow it was a very, very contentious way to get there. It was LGD Gaming taking on Anyone's Legend to kick off Group A, and AL is going to pick up the 3-0, but do not let the 3-0 scoreline fool you. This was not a blowout series. This was not a series where LGD was just getting obliterated. Really, this wasn't even a series where AL looked all that fantastic. This was AL getting gigantic early game leads, trying their best to throw them away in the mid to late game, and then salvaging it at the end of each game. You know, good for them. I'm glad they were able to walk out of here with some wins, and obviously not losing a game is really good. It's good to know that this team can be consistent in that way, but holy crap, was it not really all that impressive, especially coming off of a Demacia Cup win, like winning the whole tournament. This is not the performance that I think a lot of people were expecting to see from this team. I think this is much more in line from what I was expecting from this team, where they can be a little bit more hit or miss, but at the end of the day, a win is a win, and that's really all that matters. There are good things to talk about for AL, especially earlier on in the series, so we'll get to that now. Flandre is going to get my player of the series. It felt like he was the one with the most consistent impact at the beginning here. Jace and Bessa, both of those games I thought were really strong. Even the Galio was fine. We're seeing Galio really rise in popularity as a top lane champion, which makes a lot of sense. I think in the current meta, it makes a lot of sense to get your top laner involved a lot more consistently. There are a lot of matchups that Galio is really good into, especially in Fearless. When you're going into something like Rumble, you're going to have a lot more options, and so we'll see if that continues, but Galio, Mbessa, Jace, all of these are flex picks, and those have obviously risen a lot in popularity, but Flandre, I think, is going to do really well in that meta where things are a bit more aggressive. They're a lot more 1v1 oriented on the top side, maybe not in terms of game impact, but in terms of who is winning in the top lane. It's a lot more about who can actively just win early in their 1v1 matchup in the isolated situations. I think Flandre is going to be really good at that. Sassy, obviously a rookie, not somebody that you were expecting a ton out of, and Flandre, very experienced player, Worlds winner. This wasn't entirely a shock to see him play so well, but it is nice to see him start off so hot after I thought he really didn't play all that great in 2024 when he was on JD Gaming. It's nice to see that kind of transition into something good, carry over that Demacia Cup form. I think the other players to shout out here, obviously Shanks in terms of the KDA. I think the KDA is more impressive than maybe the actual plays themselves. Zhao Qinghua on the other side, which by the way is how I learned to pronounce, the mid laner for LGD is Zhao Qinghua, but he was fine, I would say, in terms of the matchup. Maybe died a little bit too often, but Shanks was, playing assassins. Like, this is just kind of the classic Shanks game. We'll see if this carries over. He has always been somebody who starts off splits really hot, so that's really good for him, but it was Kale that impressed me as kind of the secondary player for this team. The Alistair in particular in game 3 at the end there was super important, and maybe he was getting caught too much, maybe he was out of position, maybe he was one of the reasons why this team was a little bit too flippy in a game like this. But at the end of the day, if you make the big play at the end of the game, that's really all that matters to get there. I still think Flandre was definitely the most relevant. Shanks probably up there with him, but Kale important as well. Hope, Tarzan, they were fine. Again, I would love to see this team really hammer down some sort of like macro consistency in terms of how they play out the map in like the late game, but at the end of the day, this is LGD. They were probably just limit testing in certain situations, and game 2 still was really good. Like, it was really clean to watch. It was really mostly game number 3 that leaves a bad taste in your mouth when it comes to AL, but the first part of this series was so strong, and they won 3-0. I'm not going to criticize them too heavily. This still should be a team that succeeds really, really well. For LGD, I think it's just very clear where this team is at this point. Like, they still have a really bad bot lane, even if the top side of the map is going to be competitive. Xiaoya is a very easy choice for dud of the series. This guy is just not good. He has not been good at the LPL level. I would argue that he was better than Kepler last year, if only because Kepler was actually miserable, like unplayable at certain levels, but Xiaoya is not the kind of guy that you can feel good about starting in your AD carry role in a league where every AD carry is at the very least average or even just slightly below average. Like, Xiaoya is not going to be able to get away with, being able to survive in that environment. I think he is going to continue to get really abused, and it's not like I think YCX is that good of a player in the support position. I think this is likely going to be the worst bot lane outside of Team WE in the entire league, and again, that's just not really a big encouraging sign. That was very much abused by Kale at the end of this series and really abused by the entire team throughout the entirety of the first 2 games. Zhao Qinghua and Climber, I think, continue to show good synergy as a duo. Climber in particular was really good in this series, and I think is kind of the guy to watch out for on LGD. Saucy, I think, was generally fine in terms of the 1v1 on the top side, but if you're not going to have a bot lane, like, that's been LGD's kryptonite over the past couple of years, as them not being able to survive on the bottom side of the map, regardless of what happens mid lane, regardless of what happens on the top side. Saucy and Climber in particular, definitely kind of the standout here, like I said before, but LGD's not going to be good. Group A is, I'm not going to say determined, but the 2 worst teams in the league, in my opinion, are in Group A, and LGD very much fits one of those molds. AL definitely took a lot more to beat them than I was hoping to see, but a win is a win at the end of the day, and really the goal for AL is not to fight for their way out of the group. Their goal is to get ready for the playoffs because they should pretty easily make top 2 here. But now we move on to our 6th series of week number 1, and we're going back to Group C for our back-to-back champions debut here in the LPL. It's Bilibili Gaming taking on Edward Gaming, and BLG does get the job done here. A 3-0 sweep, and unlike the 3-0 sweep we just talked about when it came to Anyone's Legend, this one very much lived up to the scoreline. This is exactly what you would expect as a 3-0 from the best team in the league, and BLG is showing no signs of slowing down. This might be the revenge tour that we were looking for from Bilibili Gaming, because if you wanted to see a breakout performance from the solo laners, here it was. 2 of the best players in the world, maybe the 2 best players in the world. I think that that's actually a pretty fair way to categorize Bin and Knight. They were unbelievable in this series, and Edward Gaming just had no answers. It's going to be a little bit difficult for me to identify like the strengths and the weaknesses of Edward Gaming because they are going into the best team in the league, but I think there are things to talk about in terms of how they ended up playing playstyle-wise that do concern me. But for Bilibili, I mean, Bin is player of the series. Come on, dude. This is genuinely one of the best performances we've seen from Bin in quite a long time. And it's not like Bin underperforms. It's not like this guy is just a scrub every other game. This guy is dominant week in and week out. And this was still an unbelievable showing from him. The Jace, the Gnar, even the Cassante in game number 1, but especially those back half games, like actually ridiculous. It genuinely was absurd watching him. This is like best player in the world type of performance here from Bin. And it just continues to hammer my point home. I got so much criticism at the start of 2024, like at the end of 2023, when I was saying that Bin was the best top laner in the world. Every T1 fan wanted to come out of the woodwork and say I was crazy for not saying it was Zeus. There were 369 fans that were saying I'm underrating 369 because he's so much better on weak side. I've stuck to my guns and, continued to say that Bin is the best top laner in the world. And now if you don't say that, you're crazy, right? Like that's just become so consensus that everybody agrees with it. It's like the most unanimous opinion in the world, really glad to have been on that train for a really long time. BLG is just generally a team that I think I've had really good opinions on. With the individual players, I talk about Elk and On a lot, but Bin definitely falls into that regard. Knight obviously falls into that regard, but it's crazy to watch Bin just be the best player in the world on things like Gnar, where you're really not supposed to do that on that champion. ZDZ had no chance in this series, and we will talk about that later, but, awesome series from Bin. Really nothing else to say. Knight was also excellent. Like, I think it's going to go a bit under the radar how good Knight was in this series and how much more active he was than Angel on the map in terms of how he played things, purely because, Bin was so good in taking a lot of the attention, I think, away from Knight, but he was excellent in the back half of this series. Things like Vladimir and Swain, we're seeing Vlad played a lot more in pro play right now. I think it's going to be interesting to see if that sticks, just to play safe in the early game and play for these Otacon fights. It's definitely the ideology that a lot of these LPL teams want to go for, but Swain fits that as well. Knight just can do whatever you want. He is about as versatile as a player as you could possibly get, versatile of a player as you could possibly get. He can play carries, he can play, facilitators, he can play for late game, he can play for early game, he can roam a lot, he can play for lane. It genuinely does not matter. You can ask him to do whatever you want him to do, and he's going to excel at it. The solo laners are the best in the world for Bilibili Gaming. That's why they made the World Finals last year, and they continue to look utterly dominant. Elk and On were still excellent. It's so funny to watch On do the 1v1 because you've got a team with Bin and Knight, Elk even, that are ridiculously talented, and you've got your support doing the 1v1s. I get that he's kind of like the Solo King tournament, champion, but it's just a very funny thing to watch. On is still, On. He's still going to get some of that inting experience out early on in the season. Hopefully he can clean things up, but some incredible engages throughout this series, and then Elk was great at following up. Wei was really good as a facilitator, but definitely the player that I noticed the least throughout a lot of these games. Xiaohao was generally fine on the other side, definitely the best player for EDG. We will talk about him, but it's Bilibili Gaming. They got the job done. They were dominant here. And then for EDG, oh my god, the solo laners, they just fell apart here. It was not particularly close. ZDZ, very easy choice for dud of the series. I mean, he got obliterated by Bin. I mean, there was really no way for him to be able to survive this. The mechanical difference between these two players is just absolutely ginormous. I like EDG, but if they are going to lose games, if they are going to have a weak link, I expect that to be ZDZ on the top side, and especially from what we've seen so far in the LPL, it actually feels like top lane's in a pretty good spot right now in terms of how the season or the split has started off, and if ZDZ is going to be a bottom 3 or a bottom 4 top laner, that's really going to hurt EDG's chances of getting out of this group as the second team. Group C is still very wide open, but ZDZ cannot play like this against LNG and Thunder Talk and have this team still be able to succeed. That's all I'll really say. Angel also just playing like very old school Angel. This is the version of Angel that I was criticizing on this channel for a really long time. That 2020, 2021 version of Angel that was just giving up every resource, not even attempting to try to win the game on his own and just like sacking everything. I hate that style for Angel. I think the moment that he really started to be like, I gotta take over games on Ninjas in Pajamas a couple of years ago, and then obviously last year as well, at times on OMG, that was when he really started getting back into form and really started showing a lot of the things I needed to see to feel good about him. This was like complete famine Angel game. And again, like going back to those 2020 performances where he's just playing for his jungler. I don't really like that style. I think Xiaohao benefited from it, and Xiaohao was really good in this series, but, if you want a sentence that I say a lot on this channel, Xiaohao was the best player on a losing team. Like, it happens so frequently for this kind of player that I do think Angel needs to start stepping up and be that secondary carry for this team. Assume was not good enough to take that role in this one. Yes, it's Elk and On, but I'm worried about Assume's long-term success rate. Again, a lot of these AD carries that everybody projects super highly, I'm not as high on. Like players like Leave and Assume and 1xN, a lot of the players in that bubble, I just don't feel quite as guaranteed are going to be good as everybody else does. Assume and Wink were not particularly good in the bot lane here, and if Angel is just going to give up everything, I think that is a major detriment and a very big hurdle to overcome for Edward Gaming, but at the end of the day, this is Bilibili Gaming. You're playing the best team in the LPL by a pretty large margin, and you got beat. You got beat pretty easily, and as long as you're able to shake this off and still win some series against the other two teams, it's still very realistic for this team to be able to get out of this group in the top 2. I certainly wouldn't put it past them because I think Xiaohao is good enough to be the best player on a team that ends up in the top 8. But for Bilibili, top 1, like Bin's top 1, Knight is top 1, Elk is top 1, On is maybe top 1, Wei I think could be top 1 by the end of the year. This could be the best team in the world. I think it's very reasonable to expect the revenge tour to continue for Bilibili, and hopefully they can keep up this level of form because this is like a world's winning level of performance from Bilibili. But that's going to bring us to our 7th and final series of week number 1, and we finally get to see my favorite team in the world take the Rift for the first time in 2025. It's Top Esports taking on Team WE. And unfortunately, the good guys couldn't come away with a victory in this one. Jokes aside, obviously a 3-0 for TES was very expected here. WE came in dead last in terms of my power rankings, and I've been talking about this team for a little while about how funny it is that they're put together, but they put up a pretty decent fight, all things considered. Game 2 was actually fine, I would say, from WE. Good moments, bad moments. I think you're not going to really talk about the bad moments when it comes to WE because you just want to look for any sense of hope that this team could be playable throughout the year of 2025, and I think they showed enough hope here in Series number 1 to kind of give you some ideas that they could beat a team like LGD and end up getting third in a group like this, but Top Esports is just so out of the realm of touchability for WE, even with this team making some mistakes in some critical areas, which we will talk about, that, I'm not going to sit here and expect them to make top 2 or anything like that. Obviously, they shouldn't be competing for, anything other than, like, hopefully not bottom 1, right? But at the end of the day, Top Esports looking solid. Player of the series was kind of difficult. I think everybody had a pretty good series, all things considered. Cream is going to get it for me, though. I thought that Orianna game in particular in Game 1 was probably the most impressive game of the series. Cream getting mega robbed of player of the game there. Kanavi ended up getting it for game number 1. Nocturne was good, but, like, the Orianna was crazy good for Cream. Like, he ended up playing that one incredibly well, and I continue to think that Cream is just one of the most consistent players in the entirety of the LPL. It's crazy, considering what he was on OMG, that he's kind of turned into somebody that is just the pinnacle of game-to-game consistency, but it's kind of who he has been the last year or so. Karis was playing fine for WE on the other side of this. He certainly wasn't running it down. He was definitely the best player on WE, in my opinion, but Cream was really good. He was even better, and so big ups to him. You could talk about the Vladimir and the Smolder games not being, like, as dominant, but he was still really good on the Smolder in Game 3, and the Orianna was, like I said, the best game in the series, in my opinion, from anybody. If you wanted to give this to Kanavi, I think that's also fair. Again, the Nocturne was really good and really important in game number 1. I don't think Nocturne is the kind of champion that I expect to see in a lot of other regions that don't have full Fearless. I think the big advantage of Nocturne Orianna is that you can play it without really feeling all that contested, and that you can leave up a lot of other mid lane or jungle picks for later on in the series to use, but it worked out here for Top Esports, and I think if you are a really aggressive team with a jungler that wants to play really aggro in the mid game, then yeah, you can probably get away with it. If your mid laner is as good as Cream is right now, then yeah, you can probably get away with it. So Kanavi, Cream definitely stepping up. 369 was good on the top side, definitely better than Cube, who was basically irrelevant throughout this entire series. Wasn't great, wasn't bad, just kind of was there. Jackie Love was really good on everything that wasn't Misfortune. The Ashe in particular in game number 3 I thought was awesome. Definitely was the one to kind of carry that back half. If you're looking for a negative for Top Esports, Crisp kind of crisped this game up. Really no other way to say that. He is the player that we all think he is when he's winning, and when he finds those flank angles and they look really good. He's going to look like $1 million. He's going to look like the best support in the world, and when they don't work, when he's getting caught out or when he's losing in the 2v2, he's gonna look like he's actually inting and running it down, very Hylissang-esque in that regard. But it's Crisp. Like, you live with what you get from him. I think he was generally fine. Just a couple of really bad moments, and if you're looking for negatives, he is definitely the one who kind of stands out in the negative department for Top Esports, but this was still a series where they were utterly dominant outside of that second game with the Misfortune Alistair, and, I'm not going to criticize Top Esports too much for essentially having a slightly better version of what Anyone's Legend had earlier on in the week as their other group opposition, I guess you could say. But for WE on the other side, like, this is fine. They just got outplayed by Top Esports. It's not the worst loss in the entire world. Dead of the series is going to go to Tianjin. Kind of concerning that this looked a lot closer to Invictus Gaming Tianjin than it did to OMG Tianjin, but at the end of the day, he pulls out the Rengar in game number 1. Not working out, pulls out the Wukong and Sejuani. It just never really felt like he had control. He is going into Kanavi, who I do have as the best jungler in the LPL going into this year. I think he's going to be in a really good spot to take over, but this was a bad performance from a player that I think had probably the most optimism coming into the year in terms of the actual things that he has shown in the LPL. Everybody else has really not shown a ton at a top level. Tianjin was the only one with any sort of, like, top level dominant experience, but outside of that, I don't think anybody was, like, miserably bad. Cube was a negative for the team because he wasn't as good as 369, but he didn't really do anything. Like, he was just along for the ride, I would say, throughout the series. I know WE fans kind of hate him because he gave up on the team in 2024, and, people wanted Wayward back, but, he's whatever. Like, he's just going to be on there on the top side. He's not the biggest problem on this team. Man, Reddit loves defending Vampire, and honestly, I'm kind of here for it. I'm so used to the LPL Reddit being so negative and so toxic around its players. I'm so happy to see a player that is showing, like, minor signs of being pretty good and is getting a lot of flack by the community. I love seeing Reddit try to, like, elevate and lift up those players and say, no, actually, he did this and this that was really good. At times, he was better than Crisp in this series, and I do kind of agree with that. He was fine. He was not the problem at all in this series. I do think at times it's a little overbearing, where like Vampire is probably getting a little bit too much love for this performance. I think the Rakan and the Braum were questionable, but the Pyke, you know, if you ignore level 1, it was really good. So, you know, Vampire was solid. Like, I don't think this was the worst game he's played. Hopefully he can continue in an upward trajectory. This was like the performance of a slightly below average support, which is all you really need him to be. As long as he's not the worst support in the league, you can kind of live with that. But if you're looking for positives, Karras was really good in this series. He actually played really well for WE. He's a player that I think has looked good at lower levels a long time ago. At the very least, he's had some track record of being successful in a pro environment, and, you know, that's something that not a lot of other players on WE can actually say, and so, you know, it's good to see him come out against Cream, who is also playing well and still be useful. Taiyun was along for the ride as well. Like, he didn't do anything. He was kind of bad in the sense that he wasn't doing a lot of damage or playing the AD carry role really all that aggressively, but he also wasn't losing the game for his team, which I guess is an improvement over his time in the LCK. Overall, WE still seems pretty bad. Maybe they're not going to be the worst team in the league. I don't think this was the performance of the worst team in the LPL, but maybe it goes downhill from here. Maybe this is the best WE ever gets. I don't really know. At the end of the day, Top Esports was so much better than them that it's really hard to get like any sort of idea, because TES clearly wasn't taking this series all that seriously. Cream was excellent. Kanavi was excellent. 369, Jackie Liv, they were good. Chris certainly had some moments, but, you know, it's a 3-0 for Top Esports, and, you know, that's the expected outcome for sure. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LPL Winter Split Week number 1 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, of course, the updated standings and my updated power rankings after 1 week of action. A couple of teams, obviously, having not played yet. You've got 3 teams that have still yet to play. Technically, 1 team that has yet to play, because 2 of the teams that were 0-0 played last night. But again, that will be in the Week 2 video, because that's technically in Week 2. Apologies for that, but these were the standings after week number 1, and for the most part, everything still kind of stands the same after this time period. So we can go ahead and go into the risers and fallers and my personal power rankings and just kind of talk about where each group is landing. Nothing changing in Group A. I don't feel any different about any of the teams in Group A before I did going into week number 1. I think everybody lived up to expectations. LGD and WE were bad and not particularly competitive, and AL and Top Esports got the job done, but not in dominant enough fashion to put them above any of the other teams who were also pretty good in the top 3. So they end up staying the exact same. In Group B, you've got Weibo Gaming obviously going 2-0 and basically guaranteeing themselves a spot out of this group. Not guaranteed technically, because there could be a way for them to, you know, go 2-1, lose 0-3, and end up with one of Ultra Prime or OMG going 2-1 and, you know, winning the tiebreaker, JDG, you know, winning the tiebreaker, etc., right? Like, that's definitely technically still possible, but for the most part, realistically, they're going to get out of this group. Still going to keep them at number 5, because nobody else in the top 4 ended up underperforming at all this week, especially the top 2. Numbers 3 and 4 didn't play in week number 1, so I'm not going to make any sort of assertive judgments there, but Weibo Gaming, very much a team that does look legit, at the very least, beating up on the teams they should be. That being said, OMG is going to move down 1 spot, mostly to make room for another team moving up to number 11. You know, we'll get to that in a moment, because I think the other team played well, but OMG is who we thought they were. They're probably going to be who we think they are. Team that's going to be fine against the lower tier teams, not so much against the others. I'm interested in their matchup against Ultra Prime, but we'll see what happens with JD Gaming as well. And then in Group C, this is the first one with some actual movement. ThunderTalk jumping all the way up from number 14 to number 9. I just was not confident enough that their form in Demacia Cup was going to be translatable. You know, I kind of called them the rare Atom of this year. Rare Atom last year, obviously going top 4 in Demacia Cup and then being horrible in the spring split. Thought that could theoretically happen to a ThunderTalk team that didn't look great on paper, but their win over LNG looked like it was sustainable. So they're going to move up to number 9, at least for now. LNG is going to move all the way down from number 7 to number 10. I think they're the worst team in this group right now. I think that they look really, really bad. They have yet to have a series as this group of 5 where they've looked even competent, and so, you know, we'll see where that ends up going when it comes to LNG, but EDG is actually going to stay at number 8 despite some movement around them. You know, the number 7 team falling and the number 9 team moving up. EDG is just kind of staying stock standard. They lost to BLG. I'm not going to panic just yet. If they start to struggle against teams like ThunderTalk and LNG, yeah, I'll start to grade them as the worst team in this group, but for now, this feels like the proper ranking, having all 3 of them be essentially 8, 9, 10. I think that is accurate of the likeliness that any of these teams end up getting out of this group as the number 2 seed. And then for Group D, Some movement as well here. You've got Ninjas in Pajamas moving up 2 spots purely because I think a lot of the teams that were around this like number 7, number 8 range just didn't play well in week number 1, most notably obviously LNG dropping to number 10, but Edward Gaming I think not looking great just gave me the confidence to say that NIP is probably better than them and is probably the best of the rest at the current moment. We will see what happens in terms of that. I have not seen the NIP IG series that happened last night yet, so no spoilers for that. At least in terms of my power rankings, IG obviously staying at 4 because they haven't played. RNG is going to jump up to 11. They feel like a team that could be like near the top 10, could theoretically make a run for top 2 in this group if things go poorly for Ninjas in Pajamas. I just don't really see that happening. And then for FunPlus, they drop 4 spots. They go from number 10 to number 14. They're one of the weaker teams in the league. This young rookie core is just not working out. A big reason why I had them at number 10 is because I thought Shadow was playing with Sorrow in, and especially with him looking so bad in week number 1. Yeah, I don't really feel super confident that this team is going to be anything other than one of the weaker teams in the league, especially if they never put Shadow in. And so they are going to take that number 14 spot, but those are my power rankings. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below. Of course, I don't imagine you're going to have the exact same power rankings as me, but always curious to hear you guys' thoughts. But with that being said about the standings, let's move into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 1. Of course, we're going to be doing this every single week, even with the fact that most teams are only going to play once during the week. I still think this is the only fair way to do that. Player of the week for me is going to go to Xiaohu, the mid laner for Weibo Gaming. Weibo going 2-0 kind of necessitated one of them, somebody on the team getting player of the week, and I do think that Xiaohu was the most impressive player on the team across both series. Breathe was excellent in that first one, was probably the best individual performer in a series for Weibo this week, but he wasn't good enough in their second series to justify this. I think Xiaohu definitely earned the spot for player of the week, but he was excellent in week number 1. If he can have a full bounce back year, rather than just like a couple of nice little spurts like he had at Worlds, that's really, really good for Weibo Gaming. That was a big problem that they had last year, and that was one of the only things that held them back. If he is actually going to be consistent, that's gigantic. Runner-ups, Bin, obviously, in almost any other week, he would have gotten player of the week, but unfortunately for him, Weibo ended up going 2-0, and that kind of pushed Xiaohu over the edge in my eyes. And then Tong Yuan. I was really impressed with how Tong Yuan played that series for RNG. If he's actually going to be that scrim god, that like really good mid laner that everybody, or RNG at the very least, seems to think that he can be at the LPL level, then that's going to completely change the complexion of the team. That's why they moved up in the power rankings, and it's also, you know, something I'm really going to be monitoring going into the future. This was probably the best series Tong Yuan has played in like a year and a half, and so really excited to see that. But somebody's got to get dud of the week, and for me, it's pretty obviously going to be Xiaoya. He's just not really good enough to play at the LPL level. He was my lowest rated player on LGD in terms of my rankings coming into the year, and he was the only one with any experience. That bot lane looks like it's going to be an absolute disaster. Him and YCX do not look like they're going to be able to survive against a lot of the improved LPL bot lanes, and especially in that group with AL and Top Esports, it just doesn't really feel like that's going to be a big positive. Maybe, you know, they end up beating WE because they might be the only bot lane that's actually worse, but WE's bot lane looked better than LGD's bot lane in week number 1, so just some things to consider. Xiaoya, dud of the week, and Xiaohu is going to get my player of the week. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here and you got through the whole video, you liked my analysis on week number 1, hit the subscribe button. We're going to be talking about the LPL every single week of the regular season and in the playoffs as well, all of that stuff, and we're also going to be covering all 4 of the major regions. So LTA North, LEC, and LCK videos are coming. LCK week 1 weekly recap is going to be coming out tomorrow. Sorry, that was a bit of a tongue twister, but that's going to be coming out tomorrow, so if you're interested in that, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all